The air in the courtroom was thick with tension. Every eye in the room was fixed on the young teenager standing at the defense table. She appeared calm, almost too calm, in stark contrast to the nervousness of her surroundings. Her name was Kayla, and she was only 17. But in the moment, she seemed to stand taller than anyone in the room. The eyes of the jurors, the audience, and even the judge were fixed on her. Judge Harold Thompson, a man well known for his arrogance and ruthless demeanor, was notorious for making mockery of defendants, especially those who he believed didn't deserve to be in his courtroom. His eyes narrowed as he looked down at Kayla, clearly unimpressed by her youthful appearance. "You really think you can handle this case?" the judge asked, his voice laced with condescension. "You're just a child. What do you know about the law?" A ripple of murmurs moved through the room as people shifted in their seats. Kayla's face remained neutral, though her jaw tightened slightly. She didn't look like someone who was intimidated. She looked like someone who was about to make a point, one that would resonate for a long time. "I know more than you think," she replied, her voice steady and strong. "I may be young, but I've spent years studying the law. I know exactly what's at stake here, and I intend to prove it." Judge Thompson snorted, adjusting his glasses, clearly amused by what he considered the absurdity of the situation. He leaned back in his chair, shaking his head as he glanced around the courtroom. "Is this a joke?" he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. "A teenager defending herself in a case like this? What next? A child running for president?" Kayla's calmness only seemed to provoke him more. The tension in the courtroom began to rise. The jury shifted uncomfortably, unsure of what to make of the young girl who dared to challenge the court's authority. One of the other lawyers on the opposing side, a seasoned prosecutor named Daniel Carter, sneered at Kayla's words. "Your Honor, if it pleases the court, we request that the defendant be removed from the case," he said, his tone dripping with disdain. "Clearly, she's not fit to handle this trial. This is nothing more than a waste of the court's time." Kayla's eyes locked with his, and for a moment, the room seemed to hold its breath. "Excuse me, Mr. Carter, but you're mistaken," she said, her voice cutting through the tension like a knife. "I'm not here because I think I can't handle this. I'm here because I've studied every detail of this case. I've analyzed the evidence. And I've spent countless hours preparing for this moment." The judge raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued by the teenager's conviction, even if he didn't want to show it. He leaned forward slightly, his interest piqued by her calm demeanor and the unexpected determination that seemed to radiate from her. "You think you're ready for this trial?" Judge Thompson asked, his voice now almost teasing. "Tell me, Kayla, what do you think is the most important piece of evidence in this case? Can you even understand the complexities of what's going on here?" Kayla didn't flinch. She didn't back down. Instead, she stood tall, her eyes unwavering as she met the judge's challenge head-on. "I understand the case better than anyone in this room," she said, her voice firm. "The key piece of evidence is the alibi of my client, Mr. Douglas. The prosecution claims that he was at the scene of the crime, but the timeline doesn't add up. I've gone through the CCTV footage, interviewed witnesses, and cross-checked every piece of information. What you don't know, Your Honor, is that the prosecution's timeline is based on faulty assumptions, not facts." A ripple of disbelief spread through the courtroom. The prosecutor, Daniel Carter, looked at Kayla as though she had just claimed to be able to fly. His mouth opened in shock, but no words came out. Judge Thompson, his earlier mocking expression now replaced with a flicker of curiosity, glanced down at the papers in front of him. He seemed to consider her words, his mind racing to process what she had just said. No one had expected this teenage girl to come in with such confidence. She wasn't acting like a nervous defendant, she was acting like a seasoned lawyer, someone who had been in this position before. "And what makes you so sure of this?" Judge Thompson asked, his tone softer, though still skeptical. "I've done the work, Your Honor," Kayla replied. "I didn't come here on a whim. I've spent the last few weeks looking over the case, meeting with my client, and reviewing every single detail. What I'm saying is that Mr. Douglas didn't commit the crime. The prosecution is wrong, and I can prove it." The room was silent for a long moment. Even the judge seemed unsure of how to respond. This wasn't a case he had ever seen before, a teenager, barely old enough to vote, standing before him with such clarity and confidence. It was almost impossible to believe, yet here she was, holding her ground in a way that made even the most seasoned legal professionals look like amateurs. "Are you telling me," Judge Thompson said slowly, "that you, a teenager, are prepared to go head-to-head with the prosecution in this case? A case that could change your life forever if you lose?" "I'm not afraid to lose, Your Honor," Kayla said quietly. "I'm here because I believe in justice. And I believe my client deserves a fair trial." The judge stared at her for a moment, then looked down at his papers. His fingers tapped the desk lightly as he seemed to contemplate the situation. He glanced around the room, as if waiting for someone to object, but the silence was deafening. The jury watched intently, their expressions mixed with confusion and curiosity. It was clear they had never seen anything like this before. Finally, Judge Thompson sighed and leaned back in his chair, clearly conflicted. "Very well," he said, his voice still carrying a hint of doubt. "You may proceed. But be warned, this is not going to be easy. This is a serious case, and I will not tolerate any nonsense." Kayla nodded. "I understand, Your Honor." Without wasting another moment, she stood up, adjusting her glasses and gathering the legal documents in front of her. As she stepped forward, she could feel the weight of everyone's gaze upon her. There was no turning back now. She was about to dive into a battle that few would believe she could win. As she began to present her case, her words flowed with precision and conviction. She laid out the facts, piece by piece, unraveling the prosecution's argument. She spoke with the confidence of someone who had spent years in the legal world, even though she was just beginning her career. Her mind raced, quickly connecting the dots and pointing out flaws in the prosecution's case that no one had noticed before. The judge, still skeptical but growing increasingly intrigued, listened closely. He could see that this was no ordinary teenager. She was a force to be reckoned with, and he couldn't deny the strange, almost magnetic quality she had. She wasn't afraid. She wasn't backing down. And most importantly, she wasn't making mistakes. For the first time in the trial, Judge Thompson's attitude began to shift. He couldn't dismiss her like he had dismissed so many others before. Kayla was proving herself in ways no one expected, including the judge himself. And now, he couldn't help but wonder, could she really be telling the truth? The room held its breath, waiting for the next move. This was just the beginning of a courtroom battle that would reveal far more than anyone had anticipated. But Kayla wasn't concerned with what others thought of her. She was here to prove something far more important, that no one, no matter how young or underestimated, should be dismissed based on appearances. She was more than just a teenager. She was a force, and the courtroom had no idea what was coming next. The first part concludes with a cliffhanger, leaving readers eager to find out what happens next in Kayla's journey. The suspense builds as the judge's initial disbelief begins to shift into something more complicated. What will happen when Kayla uncovers more hidden truths in the case? How will the others react? The story keeps the reader hooked, eager to follow the twists and turns of this dramatic real-life mystery. The courtroom buzzed with a newfound energy, the tension in the air thicker than before. Kayla's opening statements had thrown everyone into a tailspin. No one, least of all the judge, had expected the teenager to come out with such force. But there she was, standing confidently before them all, presenting herself as someone who understood the intricacies of the law better than anyone could have imagined. The judge, Harold Thompson, adjusted his glasses, clearly weighing his next words carefully. He had always prided himself on his ability to control a courtroom, to intimidate anyone who dared to cross him. But here was this girl, barely old enough to drive, who had just done something no one else had managed to do. She had gotten under his skin. For a moment, there was a silence that could almost be described as reverential. Even the prosecutor, Daniel Carter, stood still, his mouth slightly ajar as he processed what had just transpired. He had expected an easy win in this case, yet it had now turned into a battle of wits. A teenager had turned the tables, and the prosecution had been caught off guard. Kayla stood at the defense table, her eyes scanning the room, her mind already racing ahead. She had barely begun, but she knew what she had to do next. This wasn't just a courtroom drama, it was her opportunity to prove not only her worth but also that justice could sometimes be found in the most unexpected places. She wasn't going to let this slip by. "Your Honor," she began, her voice clear and steady, "I would like to call my first witness." The judge looked at her, a hint of surprise in his eyes. He had expected her to stumble, to hesitate, but instead, she was taking charge. "Go ahead," he said, his voice cautious but still somewhat dismissive. Kayla turned toward the door, nodding slightly. "Please bring in Mr. Douglas." The door creaked open, and a tall man in his late 30s stepped into the room. His face was lined with worry, but when he saw Kayla, his expression softened. He had been through so much already, but now, standing in the courtroom, he seemed like he might actually have a chance. His name was Marcus Douglas, and he had been accused of a crime he insisted he didn't commit. Kayla had spent the past few weeks meeting with Marcus, poring over the details of his case. He had been in the wrong place at the wrong time, but the prosecution's case was built on assumptions, not facts. Kayla knew there was more to the story than anyone had cared to uncover. As Marcus took the witness stand, he shot Kayla a reassuring look. He trusted her. He had no choice but to. "Mr. Douglas," Kayla began, her voice calm yet strong, "can you tell the court where you were on the night of the incident in question?" Marcus cleared his throat before answering, his voice steady despite the obvious stress he was under. "I was at home, Your Honor. I've told the police this 100 times. But no one seemed to care to listen." Kayla nodded thoughtfully. "You were at home. Can you confirm this with any evidence? A phone call, a security camera, a witness?" Marcus hesitated. "I didn't have a phone on me that night. My battery was dead. But I do have a neighbor who saw me when I came home." Kayla's mind raced. This was exactly the kind of detail she had been hoping for. The prosecution had based their entire case on the idea that Marcus had been near the scene of the crime, but now she had a witness who could confirm his alibi. She knew that if she could get this witness on the stand, the entire case could unravel. "Thank you, Mr. Douglas," Kayla said, turning toward the judge. "Your Honor, I would like to call Mr. Douglas's neighbor, Ms. Emily Harris, to the stand." The judge nodded reluctantly, and the door opened again. In walked a woman in her mid-30s, dressed in a simple blouse and skirt. She looked nervous, but she stood tall as she approached the witness box. Her eyes flickered toward Marcus, and then she focused on Kayla, giving her a small, encouraging smile. Kayla nodded at her, then turned toward the jury. "Ms. Harris, can you please tell us what you saw on the night of the alleged crime?" Ms. Harris cleared her throat before speaking. "I saw Marcus come home around 9:15 p.m. He was walking up the street to his apartment, and I remember because I was on my porch at the time. I waved, and he waved back. I know it was exactly that time because I had just gotten home from work, and I always check the time when I walk in." Kayla smiled. This was the key. This was the evidence she needed to prove Marcus's innocence. "Thank you, Ms. Harris," Kayla said. "Now, can you confirm that Marcus was at home, as he has stated?" "Yes, I can," Ms. Harris replied. "I saw him clearly. He was alone, and he was walking straight to his apartment. I didn't see him go anywhere else." The room went quiet. The weight of her testimony hung in the air, but Kayla wasn't finished. She turned to the judge, her voice steady and confident. Your Honor, the prosecution has based its case on a false timeline. They have assumed that Marcus was at the scene of the crime, but the evidence proves otherwise. We have a witness who saw him at home at the time the crime occurred. This is proof that he couldn't have committed the crime. Judge Thompson sat back in his chair, his face unreadable. He had heard the arguments, but there was something in the air now, a shift in the courtroom dynamic. Kayla had caught everyone off guard. She wasn't just a teenager defending a client, she was a skilled lawyer exposing the flaws in the prosecution's case. The judge couldn't ignore the facts, even if he didn't like the source. "Thank you, Ms. Harris," the judge said finally, his voice low. "You may step down." Kayla turned to Marcus, who was looking at her with a mixture of relief and awe. She gave him a quick nod, then turned back to face the courtroom. "Your Honor, I would like to request a recess," Kayla said, her voice cool and composed. "I believe we have established that the prosecution's case is built on faulty assumptions. The evidence speaks for itself." Judge Thompson raised an eyebrow but nodded. "Very well. We'll reconvene after a short break." The gavel came down, and the courtroom erupted into whispers. Kayla felt the eyes of every person in the room on her as she walked back to her seat. The prosecutor, Daniel Carter, looked furious. He had expected a quick win, but now he was staring at a case that was slowly slipping through his fingers. He shot Kayla a glare before turning away, his mind undoubtedly racing to figure out how to salvage the situation. As Kayla sat down beside Marcus, she could feel the weight of the moment. She had taken the first step in proving his innocence, but this was far from over. The battle was only beginning. The prosecution wouldn't back down easily. They would come after her, and they would try to tear apart every piece of evidence she had just presented. But Kayla wasn't afraid. She had already come this far. She had already proven herself in a way no one expected. The rest of the world would have to catch up. As the recess began, Kayla's mind whirred with thoughts. She was just a teenager, but she was proving that age didn't define her ability to fight for justice. The courtroom had underestimated her, and now it was time to show them what she could do. The courtroom felt heavier than it had in days. Kayla could sense the eyes of the jury upon her, scrutinizing every movement, every word. The brief recess had done nothing to lessen the tension. If anything, it only intensified the growing anticipation. She could feel it in her bones, the storm was far from over. She had made her move, but the prosecution wouldn't back down so easily. As she sat at the defense table, her mind raced with the next steps. She had made a solid case for Marcus's innocence, but the next witness, the next piece of evidence, could change everything. The prosecution was formidable, and they had resources she didn't even know how to counter yet. But she couldn't let fear hold her back. She had come this far, and now it was time to go all in. Judge Thompson's gavel struck, and the room fell into an eerie silence. The trial was about to resume. "Let's proceed," Judge Thompson's voice cut through the air, his tone deliberate, almost as if he was savoring the tension. His eyes flickered to Kayla, as if testing her resolve. Kayla straightened up, her shoulders square. She was ready. "Your Honor," she began, her voice echoing in the courtroom, "I would like to call my next witness to the stand. I believe this will further corroborate Mr. Douglas's alibi and disprove the claims made by the prosecution." The judge glanced at her with an air of skepticism. He was intrigued now, but the teenager was still a mystery to him. Could she really pull this off? Or was she simply spinning a web of hope, one that would eventually come crashing down? "You may proceed," the judge said, though his words lacked the usual bite. Kayla felt a fleeting surge of confidence. She had done her homework, and she knew her next witness would be crucial. She had already spoken to the detective in charge of the investigation, a seasoned officer who had worked on high-profile cases. His testimony, if he agreed to take the stand, would deal a significant blow to the prosecution's narrative. "Thank you, Your Honor," she said, standing tall and motioning toward the door. "I would like to call Detective Lucas Wright." The courtroom door creaked open, and Detective Wright stepped inside, his badge gleaming under the harsh lights. He was a middle-aged man, with sharp eyes and a calm demeanor. Kayla had spoken with him at length during her investigation. Despite the apparent pressure from his department to close the case quickly, he had been open with her. He had his doubts about the case against Marcus, and that was why Kayla had decided to reach out to him. As Detective Wright took the stand, Kayla quickly organized her thoughts. This was it. This was the key that could unlock the door to the truth. "Detective Wright," she began, making sure her voice carried across the room, "can you tell the court what you found when you investigated the night of the alleged crime?" Detective Wright adjusted his glasses and looked directly at the jury before speaking. "I was one of the first officers on the scene that night. I can confirm that the victim, Sarah Mitchell, was found at approximately 10 p.m., dead in her apartment. The only suspect at the time was Mr. Douglas." Kayla nodded, acknowledging the officer's statement. She needed to establish the timeline. Everyone was convinced Marcus was the perpetrator because of his proximity to the crime scene. But she knew something was off. "What did you discover about the evidence at the scene?" she asked. "At first, it seemed like a clear-cut case," Detective Wright said, his voice steady. "There were signs of a struggle, and fingerprints were found on the victim's door. However, there was no physical evidence linking Marcus to the crime. No blood, no weapons, and most importantly, no solid alibi for the time of the murder." Kayla took a breath. This was the part she had to handle carefully. "Did you find anything during your investigation that would suggest Mr. Douglas was innocent?" Detective Wright paused, his eyes narrowing as he thought. "Yes, actually. I cross-checked his whereabouts that night, and it was discovered that his alibi was legitimate. He was home, as his neighbor testified. However, what struck me as odd was that someone else, someone who hadn't been on the radar, was seen near the scene that night. A figure wearing a hood, someone who seemed to be in a hurry. We couldn't make out any clear details, but it raised questions." Kayla's heart raced. This was the break she needed. If she could get the jury to focus on this unknown figure, it could cast doubt on the prosecution's narrative. "Detective Wright," Kayla pressed, her voice firm, "do you believe that Marcus Douglas could have been in the area at the time of the crime, as the prosecution claims?" The detective hesitated before answering, his voice quiet but resolute. "No. Based on the evidence I reviewed, I don't think Marcus was involved. He had a legitimate alibi. However, there are still unanswered questions. I believe there's someone else involved, but we need more to go on." The courtroom erupted into a murmur. Kayla's heart skipped a beat. This was exactly what she needed to hear. The detective's testimony had just created a crack in the case, a crack she could drive a wedge into. "Thank you, Detective Wright," she said, nodding toward the witness box. "No further questions." The judge looked from Kayla to the prosecution, his eyebrows furrowing slightly. This was not the outcome he had expected when he had first entered the courtroom that morning. It wasn't just that the defense was making a solid case. It was that Kayla was doing something most seasoned lawyers wouldn't have been able to do. She was uncovering facts and exposing holes in the prosecution's story that should have been evident long ago. As the detective stepped down from the stand, Kayla felt a wave of accomplishment. But there was still a long way to go. The prosecution would come for her next. They would tear apart every piece of her argument, every bit of evidence she had painstakingly put together. But in that moment, she couldn't help but feel a small victory. The prosecutor, Daniel Carter, stood up, his face tight with frustration. He had already been blindsided once by Kayla's brilliant strategy. Now, he had to recover. He wasn't going to let this inexperienced teenager win. Not on his watch. "Your Honor," Carter said, his voice icy, "I request that the defense be instructed to stop wasting the court's time with these irrelevant distractions." We have clear evidence linking Mr. Douglas to the crime scene. All this talk about alibis and witnesses doesn't change the fact that he was seen fleeing the scene. Kayla took a deep breath. She was ready for this. Your Honor, she interjected, her voice calm but forceful, the prosecution's so-called evidence is circumstantial at best. My client has a solid alibi, and the detective has confirmed that someone else was near the scene. The prosecution hasn't even addressed this new lead. Judge Thompson leaned forward, clearly weighing his options. This was getting complicated, and he wasn't used to being caught in the middle of a case like this. He had no love for underdog stories, but something about Kayla's determination made him uneasy. It was as though she had something up her sleeve that no one could predict. Very well, he said slowly, after a long pause. The defense has made its point. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. We will reconvene tomorrow morning. As the gavel came down, Kayla felt a mixture of exhaustion and triumph. She had done what she had come here to do. But she also knew that the battle was far from over. The prosecution had not yet shown its full hand, and tomorrow would bring a new set of challenges. Marcus looked at her, his expression filled with gratitude. He had no idea how this was all going to play out, but Kayla had given him something he hadn't had in a long time, hope. As the courtroom emptied, Kayla walked out of the building, her thoughts racing. She had exposed the cracks in the prosecution's case, but there was one question she couldn't answer: who was the person seen near the crime scene? She didn't have an answer yet, but she was going to find it. Tomorrow, the investigation would continue. And Kayla would make sure the truth came to light, no matter the cost. The next day came far too quickly. Kayla didn't sleep much the night before. The adrenaline from the trial had kept her awake, her mind running over every piece of evidence, every piece of the puzzle that was still missing. She had won her battle so far, but she knew that winning the war wouldn't be as easy. The prosecution had been shaken, but they weren't backing down. She had spent most of the night reviewing the detective's testimony and trying to make sense of the new lead. Someone else had been at the crime scene, someone who hadn't been seen by anyone until now. But who were they? What was their connection to Marcus? And more importantly, how could she prove their involvement? Kayla hadn't been able to reach Detective Wright after the previous day's testimony. He had left the courthouse in a hurry, and Kayla didn't want to risk calling him in the middle of the night. But she needed more information. She needed to know everything about this mysterious figure. As she arrived at the courthouse early the next morning, she felt the weight of the day pressing down on her. The courtroom was going to be full, and the jury's attention would be on her. Every move, every word mattered now. The defense table felt cold as she sat down, her thoughts spinning. Marcus was already there, his face drawn and tired. She gave him a reassuring smile, but she could see the worry in his eyes. This trial was wearing him down. You did great yesterday, Marcus said quietly, his voice barely a whisper. I'm starting to believe we might actually win this thing. Kayla nodded, though she didn't feel as confident as she appeared. We've made progress, but the game's not over yet. We still have a lot of work to do. Just then, the doors to the courtroom opened, and the judge entered, his gavel slamming down with authority. Order in the court, Judge Thompson's voice rang out, sharp and clear. We will continue with the trial. Kayla stood up, her heart pounding. She glanced over at the prosecution's table, where Daniel Carter was already preparing his notes. The look in his eyes made it clear that he wasn't going to go down without a fight. Your Honor, Kayla began, her voice calm yet filled with resolve, I would like to continue presenting my case. Yesterday, we uncovered new evidence that calls into question the validity of the prosecution's claims. I would like to call my next witness to the stand. Judge Thompson raised an eyebrow. This better be good, Ms. Anderson. The court is tired of distractions. Kayla ignored his comment. It didn't matter what he thought. What mattered was that she had the truth on her side, and she wasn't going to stop until the jury saw it too. "I called Detective Lucas right back to the stand," Kayla said. There was a murmur of surprise from the gallery. The judge didn't seem pleased, but he nodded curtly. "Very well. Detective Wright, you may return to the stand." The courtroom door opened, and Detective Wright stepped inside, his expression unreadable. He took the stand once again, his eyes meeting Kayla's with a sense of quiet understanding. The detective knew the stakes were high now. If this testimony didn't work, the case could slip through their fingers. "Detective Wright," Kayla began, her voice steady, "you testified yesterday that there was another individual seen near the scene of the crime, someone who was not identified. Can you tell the court more about this person?" Detective Wright took a deep breath before answering. "We found a witness who had been walking near the scene of the crime around the time of the murder. This person, who we later learned was a male, was seen running away from the scene just moments after the incident took place." Kayla leaned forward, her eyes fixed on the detective. "Did this witness provide any more details about the individual they saw?" The detective nodded. "Yes. The witness said the man was wearing a dark hoodie, and his face was partially covered. But what struck me as odd was the witness's description of the way the man moved. According to the witness, this man had a limp, something that we hadn't heard about until now. It's a small detail, but it could be important." Kayla felt her pulse quicken. A limp? This was the first solid clue they had about the mystery person. It was something specific, something that could be used to track down the individual. But she needed more. "Thank you, Detective Wright," Kayla said, her mind racing. "Now, can you tell the court what steps were taken to identify this individual?" The detective hesitated, his jaw tightening. "We tried to track down the witness, but they disappeared after giving their statement. They were never found, and we couldn't get any more details. We ran a sketch of the person based on the witness's description, but it didn't lead anywhere." Kayla frowned. This was a setback, but it wasn't the end. "So, to clarify," she said, turning to the jury, "we have a witness who saw a man with a limp running away from the scene, but no one knows who he is. Is that correct?" "Yes," Detective Wright confirmed. Kayla nodded slowly. The prosecution would have a hard time refuting this new development. This was the crack in their case, the opening that could lead to the truth. "Thank you, Detective Wright," Kayla said, sitting back down at the defense table. She glanced at the prosecutor, Daniel Carter, who was already scribbling in his notepad. He was clearly preparing for his cross-examination, but Kayla wasn't worried. She had the facts on her side. The judge turned his attention to the prosecution. "Mr. Carter, you may cross-examine the witness." Carter stood up, his face a mask of frustration. He was clearly not thrilled with the direction the case was taking, but he had no choice but to do his job. "Detective Wright," Carter began, his voice dripping with skepticism, "you've just testified that a witness saw a man with a limp running away from the scene. But isn't it true that the witness was unable to identify this man or even provide a clear description?" The detective nodded. "That's correct. The witness couldn't identify the man, and the description was vague at best." "So, you're telling the court that we're supposed to take the word of an anonymous witness who disappeared without a trace?" Carter scoffed. "How can we rely on such flimsy evidence?" Kayla felt a surge of frustration, but she held her ground. "Your Honor," she interjected, "the prosecution is trying to discredit the only lead we have. The fact remains that someone was near the scene who hasn't been identified, and this is important. The defense is not asking you to believe the witness's word alone. We are asking for a thorough investigation of this new lead." Judge Thompson nodded, though his expression remained neutral. "The court will take this into consideration." Kayla turned back to Marcus, who was sitting quietly beside her. His eyes were wide with concern, but there was a flicker of hope there too. Kayla could see it. He had believed in her from the beginning, but now, more than ever, he was starting to believe in the possibility of justice. As the court session adjourned for lunch, Kayla found herself once again alone with her thoughts. The evidence she had just presented was significant, but it wasn't enough to win the case on its own. She needed more. She needed to find the mysterious man with the limp, the man who could be the key to unlocking the truth. Kayla didn't have a lot of time. The prosecution wasn't going to sit back and let her run with this lead. She needed to act fast. "Kayla, what's next?" Marcus asked, his voice low as they walked out of the courtroom together. "I'm going to find out who that man is," Kayla said, her voice firm. "And when I do, we'll have everything we need to clear your name." Marcus nodded, his eyes filled with gratitude. "I trust you. I know you'll do whatever it takes." Kayla smiled, but her mind was already 1,000 steps ahead. She had no idea where this mystery would lead, but one thing was certain. The truth was out there, and she was going to find it. The morning light was harsh, cutting through the blinds of Kayla's small apartment. She had hardly slept. The hours spent combing through files, analyzing evidence, and making frantic phone calls had drained her, but there was no time for rest. The trial was moving forward, and with every passing hour, the stakes grew higher. Marcus's fate was hanging in the balance, and she was the only one who could change it. She had a lead. A significant one, in fact. The man with the limp, the witness's description was all she had to go on, but that small detail could be the key to unraveling everything. The detective had been clear, they had no idea who the man was. He had vanished into thin air after the incident, and despite the department's efforts, no one had been able to track him down. But Kayla wasn't like the others. She was determined to find him. She glanced at the clock. It was almost time to head back to the courthouse, but her mind was still reeling from the information she had uncovered. The man with the limp had to be someone who had been close to the crime scene, yet no one had seen him before. He was the missing link, and finding him could turn the entire case around. Kayla grabbed her coat and hurried out the door, her thoughts racing faster than her footsteps. She needed a plan, a way to track down this person who might hold the key to Marcus's innocence. It wasn't going to be easy. The man had disappeared, and there were no records of him in the police database. He had no known ties to Marcus or the victim, Sarah Mitchell. But one thing was clear, the man was out there, and Kayla was going to find him. As she arrived at the courthouse, the tension in the air was palpable. Reporters lined the hallway, their cameras flashing as they jostled for position. Kayla tried to block them out. She had no time for the press. All she could focus on was the trial and the task ahead of her. Inside the courtroom, things were already heating up. The prosecution was wrapping up their cross-examination of Detective Wright, but it was clear they were struggling to counter the defense's narrative. Every time they tried to poke holes in Kayla's case, she had an answer. She wasn't backing down, and it was starting to show. The jury seemed to be paying closer attention now, their faces more engaged than they had been at the start. Kayla sat down at the defense table, exchanging a brief look with Marcus. He gave her a small, encouraging smile, but she could see the anxiety in his eyes. He was scared, and who could blame him? The weight of the trial was crushing. Yet, despite everything, he still believed in her. That belief fueled her determination to see this through. "Your Honor," the prosecutor, Daniel Carter, said, his voice cold, "I would like to call our next witness to the stand." Kayla straightened in her chair. It was about to get more intense. She had a sense of what was coming. "Please proceed," Judge Thompson replied, his voice stern. Carter's eyes flicked over to Kayla, a subtle, almost triumphant gleam in them. Kayla had a sinking feeling in her stomach. Carter had been too quiet during the cross-examination. It was like he had been holding back, waiting for the right moment to strike. The courtroom door opened, and a man walked in, tall, with sharp features and a confident stride. He was dressed in a suit, and his expression was unreadable. This wasn't just any witness. This was someone important. Your Honor, Carter said, I would like to introduce Mr. Thomas Reeves, a former colleague of Marcus Douglas. Kayla's heart skipped a beat. The name didn't ring a bell. She had never heard of a Thomas Reeves before. Was he another witness from Marcus's past? Someone who could shed light on his character, or worse, someone who could paint him in a negative light. Mr. Reeves took the stand, his demeanor calm and collected. He gave a slight nod to the judge before turning his attention to the jury. Kayla studied him carefully, trying to read his expression, but there was nothing. Just cold indifference. Mr. Reeves, Carter began, can you tell the court how you know Mr. Marcus Douglas? Reeves's voice was smooth and controlled. I've known Marcus for several years. We worked together on a number of projects. He was a brilliant student, very dedicated to his work, but... Reeves paused, as though weighing his words. But there was always something off about him. Something that didn't sit right. Kayla's stomach twisted. This wasn't the testimony she had been expecting. What do you mean, Mr. Reeves? Carter prompted. Reeves looked down for a moment, collecting his thoughts. He had a temper. A short fuse. There were incidents, small things. Arguments with colleagues, outbursts that were a bit much. I never saw it escalate, but there were always rumors about his behavior. Kayla clenched her fists under the table. This wasn't good. The prosecution was trying to paint Marcus as unstable, as someone capable of violence. But she knew this was just an attempt to discredit him. Did you ever witness Marcus Douglas behave in a violent manner? Carter pressed. Reeves hesitated, then shook his head. No, nothing physical. But the anger was there. He had a lot of anger in him. Kayla had to hold herself back from standing up and interrupting the witness. This was a character assassination, plain and simple. There was no evidence to suggest Marcus had a violent streak. No history of violence. This was just speculation and rumor. But it was working. The jury was listening, nodding as Reeves spoke. Carter wasn't finished. Did Marcus ever express hostility toward Sarah Mitchell? Reeves's eyes flickered for a moment, but he quickly recovered. I don't know. But there were rumors that they didn't get along. Some of the students talked about it. Kayla felt the blood rush to her face. This was ridiculous. There was no proof of any animosity between Marcus and Sarah. This was just another attempt to smear his character. Thank you, Mr. Reeves, Carter said, turning toward the judge. I have no further questions. Kayla took a deep breath and stood up. She had to fight back, or the jury would start believing this nonsense. She couldn't let them paint Marcus as a ticking time bomb. Your Honor, she said, her voice calm but firm, I would like to cross-examine this witness. Judge Thompson nodded, giving her the floor. Kayla turned toward Mr. Reeves, her mind racing. She had to be careful. She couldn't let him get away with this. Mr. Reeves, she began, her voice steady, you've testified about some general rumors and vague incidents involving Marcus. But can you tell this court, in your own words, if you ever saw him act violently toward anyone? Reeves hesitated again, his eyes darting to the jury before he spoke. No, I didn't see him act violently toward anyone. Thank you, Kayla said, keeping her tone neutral. And yet, you've come here today to suggest that Marcus is capable of violence, based on nothing more than rumors? Reeves shifted uncomfortably in his seat. I'm just telling you what I heard. Kayla pressed on. So, you have no first-hand knowledge of any violent behavior from Marcus? No, Reeves admitted reluctantly. Kayla turned to the jury, her voice stronger now. Ladies and gentlemen, what you've just heard is pure speculation. Mr. Reeves has no evidence to back up his claims. There is no history of violence, no criminal record, and certainly no motive for Marcus to harm anyone. This testimony should be taken with a grain of salt. She let the words hang in the air, the weight of her argument sinking in. Reeves was nothing more than a man who had heard a few rumors and decided to share them without any evidence. The prosecution was grasping at straws. "Thank you, Mr. Reeves," Kayla said, sitting down. She glanced at Marcus, who gave her a small, grateful smile. She had done what she could for now, but the game was far from over. As the court session ended for the day, Kayla made her way out of the courtroom, her mind already focused on the next move. She had a lead, yes, but it was still too vague. The man with the limp could be anywhere. But Kayla knew one thing for sure, she wasn't going to give up until Marcus was free. She couldn't afford to. The courtroom was packed. The air was thick with anticipation, the sound of murmurs filling the space as the jury filed in. Kayla stood at the defense table, her hands folded, her heart pounding in her chest. This was it. The final day. The culmination of weeks of intense preparation, sleepless nights, and endless moments of doubt. Today, the truth would finally come to light. Kayla glanced over at Marcus, who was sitting beside her, his face a mask of exhaustion and nervousness. The strain of the trial had taken its toll on him, and she could see the tension in his shoulders. But he was holding on, just like she was. They had been through so much together, and no matter what happened today, they had come this far. He had believed in her from the start, and now, she was going to make sure he was free. The judge entered, and the courtroom fell silent. Judge Thompson's gavel slammed down. "Order in the court," he announced. "This is the final day of proceedings. Ms. Anderson, do you have any further witnesses to present?" Kayla nodded, standing tall. "Yes, Your Honor. I would like to call my final witness to the stand." A ripple of curiosity ran through the gallery. The jury leaned forward, and even the prosecution seemed to take note. Kayla's heart raced. She had spent countless hours tracking down this witness, a person who could change everything, someone who had been in the right place at the right time. Someone who could finally identify the man with the limp. "Your Honor," Kayla continued, "I call to the stand Sarah Mitchell's brother, David Mitchell." The gasp from the audience was palpable. Kayla knew this would raise questions. David Mitchell had been absent throughout the trial, but now, his appearance was going to shake things up. He was the key. The courtroom doors opened, and a man stepped inside, his expression unreadable. David Mitchell was in his late 20s, with short, dark hair and a serious demeanor. He walked with purpose toward the witness stand, his eyes scanning the room before settling on Kayla. "Mr. Mitchell," the judge began, "please take the stand." David nodded and took his seat. His face was tight, but there was a flicker of recognition in his eyes when he looked at Kayla. She could tell he wasn't entirely comfortable with being here, but he had agreed to help her. He had come forward for one reason, justice. "Mr. Mitchell," Kayla began, her voice calm yet commanding, "can you tell the court why you've come forward today?" David shifted in his seat. He cleared his throat before responding. "I've been following the case, and after seeing some of the testimony, I realized I had information that could help. I knew something about the night my sister was murdered that no one else did. And I needed to make sure the truth came out." The room was silent. Everyone was listening intently, waiting for him to continue. "Go on," Kayla urged. David hesitated for a moment. "The night Sarah was killed, I was at home, alone. But I heard someone outside the house. I didn't think much of it at the time, it was late, and I figured it was just some kids being rowdy. But then, I saw a man leave the property. He was limping." Kayla's pulse quickened. This was it. "Can you describe the man in more detail?" David nodded. "He was wearing a dark hoodie, and his face was mostly obscured, but I could see his limp. I couldn't make out much else. But I know what I saw. It wasn't just a random person. He was leaving my sister's house, and he wasn't walking like someone who was just passing by. He was leaving in a hurry, like he was trying to get away from something." Kayla leaned forward, her heart pounding. This was the connection they had been waiting for, the man with the limp. David Mitchell had seen him. This was the man who had been near the crime scene, the one the prosecution had dismissed as a witness too vague to matter. "Mr. Mitchell," Kayla pressed, "did you recognize this man?" David shook his head. "No. I didn't recognize him, but there was something familiar about him. I couldn't place it, but I knew he wasn't just anyone." "Thank you," Kayla said, her voice steady. "And can you tell the court if you did anything about what you saw that night?" David's eyes shifted, and for the first time, Kayla saw a flicker of guilt in his expression. "I didn't immediately report it. I was scared. I didn't know what to do. But when I saw the police release the sketch of the suspect, I knew I had to come forward. I didn't want to keep this from the court any longer." Kayla nodded. She could see the conflict in his eyes. He had waited too long, but now, he was making the right choice. "Thank you, Mr. Mitchell. You've been very helpful." David looked at her, his face softening. "I just want the truth to come out. I want justice for my sister." Kayla gave him a small, reassuring smile. "You've done the right thing." She turned to the jury, her voice strong as she addressed them. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, you have just heard from a key witness, someone who saw the suspect on the night of Sarah Mitchell's murder. A man with a limp, someone who was leaving the scene of the crime. This is the same man who had been seen by other witnesses. The same man who has remained unidentified until now. The same man who the prosecution has ignored in their rush to convict Marcus Douglas." She let her words sink in, her eyes sweeping across the jury. "This is the man who was really at the scene of the crime, and it's time we stop pointing fingers at an innocent man." Kayla stepped back and sat down, her heart racing. The jury was silent, taking in the new information. The prosecution was stunned, but Daniel Carter quickly stood up, his face hardening. "Your Honor," Carter said, "I would like to cross-examine this witness." Judge Thompson nodded. "Proceed, Mr. Carter." Carter approached the stand, his gaze fixed on David Mitchell. "Mr. Mitchell," he began, his voice sharp, "you've just testified that you saw a man with a limp leaving your sister's house, but you didn't report it right away. In fact, you waited until the trial was almost over to come forward. Doesn't that seem suspicious to you?" David shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "I didn't know what to do at first. I didn't want to get involved. But after seeing the sketch of the suspect, I realized I had to tell the truth." Carter narrowed his eyes. "And yet, you expect the jury to believe that your testimony is credible after all this time? You can't even provide a clear description of the man. How can we trust that what you saw is even relevant?" Kayla stood up before David could respond, her voice firm. "Objection, Your Honor. Mr. Mitchell has provided testimony that directly ties the suspect to the crime scene. His timing in coming forward is irrelevant. What matters is the information he has provided, and it's crucial to the defense's case." Judge Thompson glanced at Carter, then nodded. "Objection sustained. Mr. Carter, please move on." Carter seemed irritated but quickly returned to his seat, his face tightening. Kayla's heart settled slightly. She had made her point. The truth was out. The man with the limp had been identified, and Marcus was no longer the primary suspect. The court recessed for lunch, and Kayla found herself walking out into the hallway with Marcus by her side. He looked at her, his expression filled with both awe and disbelief. "Kayla," he said softly, "I can't believe it. You did it." She smiled, though it was bittersweet. "We did it. We just have to wait for the jury's verdict now." Hours later, the court reconvened. The jury filed in, their expressions grim. Kayla held her breath as they took their seats. This was the moment of truth. Judge Thompson called the jury's foreman forward. The man stood, holding a piece of paper in his hands. "Have you reached a verdict?" the judge asked. The foreman nodded. "We have, Your Honor." "Please read the verdict," Judge Thompson instructed. The foreman cleared his throat, his voice steady. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Marcus Douglas, not guilty of all charges." The words hit Kayla like a wave. Her legs nearly gave out beneath her, but she steadied herself, her eyes finding Marcus's. His face broke into a grin, relief flooding his features. The courtroom erupted into whispers and gasps, but Kayla could barely hear anything over the sound of her own heart beating. Marcus was free. The truth had won. The judge banged his gavel. "Court is adjourned." Kayla stepped forward, her arms wrapping around Marcus in a tight embrace. They had fought for this moment, and now, it was finally here. "We did it," Marcus whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "Yes," Kayla replied, her voice just as emotional. "We did." The truth comes to light in the final part of the story. The revelation about the man with the limp, combined with David Mitchell's crucial testimony, turns the tide in Marcus's favor. The jury delivers a not guilty verdict, and Kayla's hard work and perseverance pay off. The story ends with a powerful sense of relief and triumph, leaving the audience with a message of justice, truth, and resilience.